Welcome to the Nick Halaris Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Halaris, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. This week, we have a special guest, Michelle Mbekeani, who is a lawyer, a justice advocate, and the co-founder and CEO of a very interesting startup called Period. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you? Good morning.
Morning. Thank you so much for being here. I've been thinking a lot about this conversation since we met a month or so ago, and just have so many questions because you've been doing good work in an area that I think is basically top of mind for anyone who's concerned about the state of our country. And there's just so many things to get into. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm super excited, especially these issues are really coming to the forefront. So I'm looking forward to diving into them today.
Well, why don't we start with this? I figured it'd be a good place to sort of level set with the audience. Like, just let's talk about prison in America and like the scale of it and what's going on, what's working, what's maybe not working. So let's start with the raw numbers. Like, America has like a prison problem. When I say prison problem, I mean like we have a huge number of people. I don't know the number, but I'm assuming you do. How many people in America?
2.3 million. 2.3 million. Approximately, sometimes a little more than that. But yeah, 2.3 million.
Okay. And this is like people who have been sentenced. This doesn't apply to people who are awaiting prosecution.
Correct. So those who have been convicted and currently serving time incarcerated.
And what's the number for people who are waiting to be, go to trial, essentially?
Well, that number hasn't really been quantified to my knowledge because we're seeing in the landscape different states limiting the use of bail or abolishing bail like we have here in Illinois, where it's decreased the jail population. So to give an example, Illinois, Cook County specifically in Chicago, largest single site jail in America, at its peak had about 12,000 people. At COVID, we saw that come down to like 6,000, 5,000. And now recently with abolishing bail in Illinois, the first state in the country to do that, we're now seeing our jail population at its lowest at about a little over 4,000 people awaiting trial. So prior to that, it was a debtor's prison. So jails across America are very much debtor's prison. If you can't afford to bail yourself out, you're awaiting trial inside jail. But as we're seeing that scaled back with criminal justice reform across the country, we're also seeing the jail population decrease as well. So I think nationwide, I think it'll continue to decrease as we see more and more reform come to the forefront.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you about bail reform for sure. But before we get into that, just a question, like this 2.3 million number, how does that compare maybe historically? And then how does that compare to other countries? Like my understanding is it's like off the charts. Like nobody has this many people incarcerated.
We have the largest prison population in the world. And that is something that has been kind of coined as mass incarceration. The history of prison incarceration in America and the United States is a very complex history because we see this overlap between incarceration and enslavement. You see really the first time where prisons become very racialized is post-slavery. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, does have a caveat in that you cannot be forced to work unless you are serving time, serving a criminal penalty incarcerated. As that comes into play, we immediately transition as a country into convict leasing, in which we have had all these different new crimes that were disproportionately put on African Americans in the country. And once they were incarcerated, major corporations, many of which are still very profitable today, were able to lease out convicts who all happened to be African American for the most part, and a lot of times in areas that were former slave states. And so we see kind of this connection of profiting off of individuals through enslavement to transitioning that to profiting off of free labor of those who are incarcerated. And I don't think it's a coincidence that caveat to abolishing slavery made it so, well, you can still have someone work for free if they're incarcerated. And again, the South, 80% of their economy was contingent on free labor from African Americans. So I think that's when we really start seeing this racialized lens when it comes to incarceration. And that transitions more and more over time, where since the abolishment of slavery, free labor has been used in prison to this day. To this day, a lot of the major companies that we see have free prison labor. And so that boom peaks up again. We see after the civil rights movement, you see, again, this increasing the criminal code to include more and more people, harsher sentences. A lot of people say like the 1980s, 1990s, but really in the 1970s, we see the kind of the prelude to the boom of the prison industrial complex. And again, profiting off of that, but then we see enhancements and penalties. Before, children could not be sentenced as adults for a lot of different crimes, but in the 1980s, we see this huge boom of sentencing children to adult offenses, adult sentences, and that's another uptick in the population, and using kind of that rhetoric of super predator, of young people being this very dangerous population, which all happen to be Black and brown populations. And then you go into the 1990s. One, in Illinois, we abolished parole, so people did not have a meaningful opportunity to be released for good behavior. But then we see 1998 truth in sentencing. So in Illinois specifically, and a lot of different states across the country, when a judge sentenced you to 40 years, it was kind of understood that for the most part, it's going to be half of that. So while the sentence itself says 40 years, a concept we used to call day for day would be you usually do 20 years in prison. Truth in sentencing, as we have this kind of narrative in the media about, we're letting all these criminals out, and kind of really that propaganda and hyperbolic portrayal of Black and brown communities being very violent. You see that now in Illinois as it is today, and we see that across the country, and a lot of states got federal funding for these types of laws in which you can no longer do the day for day 50%, but instead for offenses like murder and so forth, 85% or 100% of your sentence. So you go from pre-1998 in Illinois, where for the most part you'd serve 50% of your sentence, to today you spend 100% of your sentence. And then you have enhancements on top of that, in which in Illinois and a lot of states across the country, if you commit an offense with a gun, it adds an additional mandatory enhancement of at least 15 years. So you have mandatory minimum of 20 years in Illinois for murder. Then if it's with a gun, a minimum of 15 added on top of that. So basically you're saying if someone murdered someone with a knife, it would be a minimum of 20. But if you do it with a gun, it's a minimum of 35. And that's how you see we've seen how policy and legislation have made it so people are serving longer and longer sentences, which means we have a larger and larger population, and more importantly, an aging population.
Yeah, fascinating. So couple follow-ups from that, because I had never really heard about this whole idea of the relationship between sort of the end of slavery and convict leasing. Like, do you have numbers on that? Like in the post-Civil War era, like how quickly did that become a thing, and how big was it in sort of the early days in the sort of the post-war era?
That's something I've been trying to research more and more. There's a great book called Slavery by Another Name that goes into how different, even plantations transitioned into slavery, into convict leasing. I don't know the exact number because the Black codes resulted in more and more people being criminalized, such as, you can't walk around without a job, or you have a curfew. And so if you violate your curfew, it would be a crime. But with convict leasing, really quantifying how many people were in that population, it's something that I'm actually still trying to look more into, of what kind of qualified as, convict leasing versus kind of this merge of also sharecropping and so forth. But yeah, that's something I've always been really fascinated to learn more about, because you're seeing a lot of these major companies, especially in the coal and railroad industry, after post-slavery, were still profitable. They took a hit for a period of time, but the interesting thing about convict leasing that was even more appealing than slavery at times was when you had a slave, that was an investment that you kept, almost like when you own a home, because slaves were essentially property. You maintain your home differently because it's your home. As opposed to when you rent an apartment, if you don't like the apartment or you cause damage, you can move. That's how convict leasing was. You're leasing human bodies. But if you treat that individual horribly, it's not an investment on you. It's not a harm on you because you just get another individual to do the work. As opposed to slavery, in which you were literally, that is your property that you have to stick with. There's no trading off or leasing for that. That's why it's called leasing. So I think with that, I would not be surprised if there were a larger boom when it comes to that population, because it became cheaper. The use of free labor became substantially cheaper because of the leasing system, where you didn't have to maintain quarters as much or take care of the family, or I wouldn't even call it take care of the family, but have the family on your plantation. You could have that person for that specific purpose and then get rid of them.
Crazy. Do you have a sense of the 2.3 million in prison today, how many are working?
That I would not be surprised if it were 100%, to be completely frank,
Okay.
because there's most jurisdictions, there's almost some shape or form, but especially on the state level. And there are a lot of prisons in America in which they'll give them, pennies for their work. Yeah. There are a lot of different products that you would not expect that are made in prison, such as, dishwashing soap and detergent. There have been companies, I believe, clothing, furniture. Furniture is actually a very interesting one. I was at a conference with a university where they're talking about, mass incarceration, prison labor. And one of the panelists brought to the attention to the audience that say, oh, as we're at this conference, by the way, this university purchases its furniture from a company that uses prison labor to build it. So that's how much it is integrated in our everyday lives and what we use, but it's something that's not really brought to the forefront. So it'll be interesting to see what states are using for what companies, but a lot of these are very notable companies. And one of the most egregious ones is a prison that's called Angola. It's in Louisiana, and it is literally a former plantation. And, there were individuals to this day that were picking cotton, a prison camp where people are picking cotton and crops and so forth. And again, fueling the economy. What was formerly a plantation is now a prison. And that's not uncommon.
Yeah. Wow. I lost my train of thought for a second because I can't believe that Angola actually exists in the modern era. Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life, as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. One of the things that I wanted to follow up on as well is you mentioned earlier in the conversation around Cook County Jail, how you called it a debtor's prison. And I want to know why you called it that and what does that mean to you? Before bail reform, obviously.
Yeah, before bail reform, the average bail amount that someone was kept in because they couldn't afford it was less than $2,000. And I call it a debtor's prison because it's alarming. And I think that's one of the reasons that really pushed the abolishing bail in Illinois is that how a couple $1,000s will make the difference of whether you enter the court through the front door in your regular attire or through the back door through a tunnel in prison clothing and handcuffs. That money makes the difference. It is alarming that the level of security that is imposed on those pre-trial in which you're brought in, you have to be in handcuffs. Your family members can't hug you as you're there. It's almost like if you're already incarcerated. Whereas if you had $2,000, you go in through the front with your family members in your regular attire, go back home, it's absolutely different. And the fact that money determines your experience in the trial proceedings is really, really something that is morally corrupt, in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
That how much money you have, not whether you're an actual threat to public safety, but how much money you have determines how you experience your trial proceedings in court. And we all know there's been studies that demonstrate that someone who comes in a prison jumpsuit during their trial proceedings and there's a jury or even just the judge, they're viewed differently. They're already viewed as a criminal because they're actually in the attire of those who have been convicted. And so there's this blur of, oh, this person is innocent until proven guilty. But if you're in the wrong attire, it's easy for someone to see you as guilty until proven innocent. Your attire alone shows the default as guilty because you're coming from a place of incarceration in the jail. And so that's one of the things where I find it to be a debtor's prison is that you are incarcerated and you have to buy your way out to not be incarcerated.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was brought to Illinois' attention, which was a good selling point as well, especially for those who like to kind of frame themselves as tough on crime, is if you are a danger to society and a judge gives you, say, $2 million bail and you have access to $2 million, you get to go home. So regardless of how dangerous you are, unless you have a no bail from the judge, if the judge gives you $10 million bail and you can post it, you get to go home and you get to carry on and show up to court when you have your court date. But money determines that. And I think that is what really was one of the selling points in Illinois, that it's beyond a debtor's prison. It's a threat to public safety for money to determine how you engage with the criminal justice system and whether you're in a situation, whether you're incarcerated pre-trial because you're a threat to public safety, or whether you're incarcerated pre-trial for this because you do not have the financial means to buy your way out.
You know, it reminds me, I've been tracking this Sam Bankman-Fried case, mostly because I know his dad. His dad was my law school professor, so I've always kind of been tracking his career.
I feel like that's like a fun fact trivia.
Yeah, fun fact trivia.
Keep us in the line.
He was a great professor. I think he looks like he might actually be in trouble himself. I hope not, but it strikes me though, just listening to you describe this, like not only is it sort of disadvantageous to enter into your trial wearing your jumpsuit just because of the nature of human bias. Like we know enough about human bias to know that that's going to have an impact. But also just from watching that case, you see that like the ability to orchestrate your defense is way better, obviously, if you're not in jail waiting trial, because you can meet with your lawyers whenever. You can just do whatever you need to do to try to defend yourself. Whereas when you're in jail, like you're probably severely limited, right? You can't do anything.
Yep, exactly. And we're seeing that exacerbated now in Cook County and across the country. A lot of correctional facilities are prohibiting any type of paper coming into the correctional facility. So actually, even in Cook County, the sheriff has, from what I last recall, barred individuals who are defendants to bring in paper back into the facility from court. So that means a public defender cannot give their client papers to bring back with them to review and so forth. And that's really critical for a participatory defense in which you're collaborating with your defense attorney, public defender, to fight your case, because you know the circumstances of your case, you know what your alibi may have been, or what witnesses can help you and assist you. That is a collaborative process, especially when our public defenders have such a heavy caseload. Participatory defense, collaborating with their clients, is actually essential. It's actually necessary for them to even have a fighting chance, because they're managing so many other clients. So they need all the help they can get. So when you have a correctional facility telling attorneys that you cannot give your clients paper to bring back because the sheriff believes that it is a safety issue, it compromises, like you said, one's ability to fight their case. And it compromises one's ability to kind of maintain their innocence. And again, they're already going up with that uphill battle of people presuming them to be guilty because of what they look like when they come into courtroom. But then on top of that, to have even a bigger hurdle to overcome that presumption of guilt in collaboration with their public defender or criminal defense attorneys. And so I think that's another thing that kind of goes back into not only limited resources when it comes to how you can fight your case, but also just the actual correctional facility not permitting paper to come in or not having any form of digital capacity for you to collaborate with your attorney. That compromises your ability to fight for your freedom.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of the Nick Halaris Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. I remembered what I was going to ask you when you told me about Angola. Okay, so I was thinking about your narrative from sort of how you get from the post-Civil War era to the modern prison industrial complex. And the question I have is like, the narrative that I've read the most in the traditional media and probably the one that people believe the most is that there was a period of time where we started passing tougher laws around drug possession. And then I think it was probably in the 90s, right around the time when they were doing the sentencing stuff. And then the prison population exploded after that as a result of these sort of possession / maybe you could argue that it was a drug distribution charge or whatever it may be. And then at the same time that was going on, states started outsourcing prisons production and prison management to sort of for-profit entities. That's the narrative that I've sort of heard over and over again. But I feel like from what you said, like this industrial complex is long in the making. It wasn't just that little time period. That was only 20 years.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's evolved. One thing I felt just looking into criminal justice reform and prison reform with all efforts made to combat it, it really feels like a game of whack-a-mole in which you address this kind of issue within the prison system or criminal justice system, and another one pops up. And I think that really stems from, the powers that be maintaining the status quo because there's so much profit in it. So with the drug cases, we saw a lot of 3 strikes laws. And that's something that we're still trying to recuperate from, in which you have 3 strikes for a felony, 3 felonies, that's a mandatory life sentence. And I just to kind of play out what that looks like, because I have an individual who was subjected to that, who I was able to assist in getting out, is you would think this is like big RICO, drug conspiracy, drug ring cases. Majority of the ones I've seen, it's less than 15 grams of personal possession. There was an individual, Mr. Brian Belmore. He had his 3rd strike, which was less than 15 grams of a controlled substance, which, he insists that, was actually planted on him. But his other 2 strikes were also nonviolent, one from the 1960s and one from the late 1970s, early 1980s. So he entered into prison in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, and he didn't get out until this past March at the age of 79 years old. The reason why he was able to get out, not because he served a sentence, because again, he had mandatory life, is because while he was incarcerated, he had an accident in IDOC where he fell off the bed and he became paralyzed essentially from the chest down. And Illinois had a law in which it was almost analogous to compassionate release, in which because of his disability, he was able to go before the prison review board and essentially advocate to have him released, that he's no longer a threat to public safety. Mind you, he was never a threat to public safety, no violent offenses at all. But because of the laws back then, he had a mandatory life sentence. Now, while the 3 strikes laws for the most part has been abolished in Illinois, it's known as the Habitual Offender Act, in which now no longer, since 2020 or 21, you can no longer use a drug offense as a strike. That is going forward. But retroactively, you still have a population that is incarcerated for drug offenses, mandatory life. And their only form of relief is clemency from the governor or legislation that would say it can be retroactive. And so that's something I've worked on both. One was a law that I'm hopefully we can get passed next year, and I actually called it the Bryant Belmore Act in honor of the individual I'd worked with. And that the benefit of the law that we have today should be applied retroactively to ensure that those who are serving a life sentence for 3 strikes can be released. In the meantime, since that law hasn't passed, we advocated to the governor of Illinois, basically asking, there's this population, I believe it was 3 individuals who were serving a life sentence, mandatory life sentence, for a 3rd strike that was a low-level drug possession. And executive clemency is their only form of relief to get out. Thankfully, the governor's office and Governor Pritzker is very big on criminal justice reform. As you can see, some of the most historic legislation in the country in the past few years has come from Illinois, and him signing and really championing it. But thankfully, his office is on the same page with that type of reform, and we anticipate him to grant those clemencies and have those individuals released, all of whom are well over the age of 60 years old. But that's an example of how, even as we have made reform with 3 strikes laws, since they do not apply retroactively, you still have that sizable population, that aging population, that are dealing with the consequences of archaic and oppressive laws of the past.
Yeah, I feel like I remember, this may have been during COVID, but it may have been more recent, where here in California, Governor Newsom was doing some of this clemency stuff for low-level drugs.
Yes, he's doing a lot of great work. He is doing a lot of great work in that space, to even closing correctional facilities.
Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. In California, they call their prisons a California Department of Rehabilitation or something like that. And I remember just even that framing of it gives a different perspective. And they call those incarcerated residents. Language is so important. How we describe individuals, how we classify and categorize individuals plays a huge role in how they're treated, how they're received, our perception of who they are, and the level of humanity and dignity they deserve. And when you acknowledge someone as a resident, as opposed to more of an object, whether it's an inmate and so forth, that plays a role in how we treat individuals. So I do definitely commend that California is really trying to make steps in reforming their system. And I think they're definitely doing an extraordinary job in reforming their prison system. And it's only up from here. Yeah.
They're trying different things for sure. I feel like, did you listen to the interview I did with the Attorney General for New Mexico?
No, I did not. I did not get to listen to that.
It's worth checking out for listeners who haven't checked it out. It's a great sort of introduction actually to this conversation we're having today, because Raul Torres, who's the AG there, he was a prosecutor. And so we talked a lot about the same subjects, but from sort of his perspective as a prosecutor. And he said a couple interesting things, which I think you would support. One is he was really negative about prison as a solution in general. Basically, his point of view from what he's seen doing prosecutions for over 15 years is that by the time someone gets to prison, it's like game over. They're going to have a very challenging life. The odds of, because he called it, I think the phrase he used was, prison is graduate school for criminals. Mm. And just the exposure, the PTSD from the experience, the most likely thing that's going to happen to someone who's in one of these really crazy maximum security prisons is they're going to come out and do another crime. What do you think about that?
No, I completely agree. I've been in the prosecutor's office for the past 5 years, doing reform work in Cook County. And I couldn't agree more. If you look at the conditions of prisons, and the lack of resources and rehabilitation programs in any state, it is this echo chamber of trauma. Especially with solitary confinement, especially with limited access to quality food or even running water. It is limited, no mental health services when you're literally living in an environment that exacerbates any prior diagnoses you have or even creates one. To have individuals in that setting, again, for decades, and then expect them when you release them, if they are released, with no support services. No, they've literally been detached from society and isolated, and a lot of times in communities that are far out of reach for their family members for decades. Imagine of the technology development we've had in the past 10 years. I have met individuals who are incarcerated for 20 years, 30 years, and they come out, and this concept of a cell phone or even attaching a document or email, or it's a whole new world. They're literally walking to a whole new world. And a lot of them have no family members left. They go in at a middle age level. It's like, who do they have left? What community do they have? So not only are you isolated in the sense of, no kind of connection to the world as is, but also just no family members. A lot of housing. A lot of times they can't get housing because of their record. Job opportunities. There are actually a lot of licenses that you are barred from getting. A lot of times in professions that provide you a certain level of independence, such as barbershop license, where you can't get it if you have a criminal record, where you can live, whether you can go to school, having to disclose that on your application, a lot of times is, something that bars you from getting education or to be even being accepted. So you have all this piled onto that. And, one of the stories someone told me when they were released is, it's like the little things. When someone was, brought into court from prison, say they're being resentenced or whatever, that drive was the most rewarding thing. Or when you got to go on work furlough, it was the most rewarding thing because they got to see what was beyond the wall. To see buildings, to see what car models are out there. It's just really think about it. Like if someone is incarcerated in downstate Illinois and we call it writ, to be writ up, isn't that like basically we bring you to court and you get to drive in the, correctional bus and you're coming into the city of Chicago. The last time you saw the city of Chicago was in the 1980s or 90s. Imagine seeing the city of Chicago for the first time in 2023. The difference. Like it's the little things that I would have not even thought about, but when hearing someone speak about it, saying, wow, he's like, I know that person really enjoyed that ride. Because you get to see what's beyond the wall.
Yeah, I find myself sympathetic to the idea that like prison is obviously a blunt tool that has a very low probability of actually working. But then I go back and I say, okay, like I want to ask you this hypothetical. Let's say you're in Illinois, you have someone that has 2 strikes and then does a violent crime and is convicted. So we're talking about 3 strikes, 3 different times, violent crime. Like, what do you do with that person? What is the right thing to do? How do you rehabilitate them? Like what are the options even besides just throwing them into one of these maximum security prisons and letting happen what happens?
Yeah. So I always was trying to figure out that answer. And it wasn't until winter of 2019, I got to travel to Germany to see their prisons. And you would have thought it was a college campus. Their rehabilitation centers in which they had keys to their own room. They had activities. They had schools that are more resourced than some of the public schools I've seen. A lot of the public school systems I've seen in America that contribute, in which their lack of resources contribute to that school to prison pipeline. And it was really emphasizing on, it was therapeutic. It was almost like intensive outpatient that we see for those battling addiction and so forth. And seeing that model demonstrated that, we're seeing it as punishment as opposed to rehabilitation. And I think we all need to have an honest conversation. Like rehabilitation is kind of the trendy word we like to use now, but prison was designed for punishment and profit. That is what the prison in America is rooted in, punishment and profit. Now we've tried to evolve into being rehabilitation, but you can put lipstick on a pig and it's still a pig. And so unless we're really diving into the foundation that has contributed to these harmful environments that we now want to slap a new label called rehabilitative centers, like that's not going to make the difference. And so it was interesting to visit facilities, campuses, which they call campuses, throughout Germany, were both for young people and adults, and these violent crimes as well. I think we have this narrative of, well, they're not experiencing violent crime. I'm like, oh no, they are. There was one individual that was in there for 10 years. It had a 10-year sentence for setting a pregnant woman on fire, you know? But you see the facility that they're in and that they were getting intensive therapy. Obviously, it's still a secured facility, but you weren't in shackles. You know, it was just the level of respect you received. It was like, we're here to, I hate to say fix, but to address the underlying issues. And prison was only reserved for those with that very much antisocial behavior. Because violent crime is antisocial behavior for the most part. But so if that's something that's how they view it. You have an antisocial behavior that is causing harm to society, and a lot of times harm to yourself. And as we see a lot of times as a result of the harm you've probably experienced and how you've been conditioned, that is something that they're addressing. And so one last point about, crime, it's interesting how we have applied the concept of PTSD to populations that have been exposed to violence in a more formal manner, such as like veterans. It's well kind of accepted that an individual that has been in environments where they see a lot of violence, or even just being around gunfire, they need additional assistance. They're going to experience the world differently when they come back home. Even in other foreign countries, which is, I find very ironic, that foreign countries in which individuals, young people have been exposed to violence, whether it's child soldiers or just being in the area, we recognize that they will move through the world differently. And it would not be uncommon for them to exhibit violent behavior because you've been conditioned, especially at your most formative years, when your brain is not fully developed. Antisocial behavior, violence is normalized because that's what you see and your brain's more exposed to it. Yet when we come to the United States, a country that is obsessed with guns, obsessed with, having readily accessible guns, and we're seeing that, a lot of people have access to guns, and it's no longer, you're essentially always bringing a knife to a gunfight. People are using guns more often. Yet we don't give that level of grace and compassion to those impacted by it, like we would in other circumstances. And I think we see that a lot amongst young people, in that I have been around young people that their yearbook has a rest in peace section every year, that they have witnessed gun violence, whether it is seeing a crime scene on their way to school, and we expect them to come to school and just be able to focus and go on and carry on. Yet we wouldn't expect that from a developed, grown adult coming back from war or just being a veteran in general. And I think so when we look at violence in America and how we punish individuals, I think there needs to be a greater level of compassion and grace, being cognizant of the circumstances and environments individuals have been pushed in, a lot of times as a result of their race and socioeconomic background and limited resources, which is a result of policy and oppression and inequality in this country. We can't just be like, oh, well, that's all on you. You made that decision. And yes, I do believe in autonomy and personal decisions, but privilege contributes to the decisions you have to make in life. So I may have made great decisions in life, but I've never been in a position where I have to make decisions that are very, very serious when it comes to violence, because I haven't been exposed to it at that level. So when it comes to crime in America and how we treat individuals, I think a blanket approach has contributed to mass incarceration in this country. not only a blanket approach, but a blind approach when it comes to being cognizant and acknowledging and validating that being in certain environments contributes to how you view the world, how you navigate the world, and especially when it comes to those who have been victims of gun violence, how you protect yourself.
Yeah. Reminds me of another thing that the Attorney General said, which is that they did a study in New Mexico where I forget the term he used, but it was essentially like some kind of measure of a traumatic incident in a person's life, whether it's violence or living on the street or whatever. Their study found that if somebody had more than 5 of these incidences before the age of like 5 or 6, the chance of them going to prison was like incredibly high. It was in like the 90s or something like that. And so that he said that really, as a prosecutor, woke him up like, holy crap, like there's like this early childhood thing, which is a much bigger issue than people who want to say it's just about choice. There is an element of choice when it comes to criminal activity that you can't ignore. But the fact that this crazy correlation exists makes you realize that the problem is bigger than just that. We got systemic problems out there as well, which is, daunting but needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's adverse childhood experiences. ACEs.
That's what it was.
ACEs, and and another term that we're also seeing that really contributes is called dually involved, in which you see individuals who are in the child welfare system. In Illinois, we call it TCFS, whether it's they've experienced childhood abuse or in foster care. It's not uncommon for that same population to be in the criminal justice system, or even sometimes at the same time. I've seen individuals who are both in the child protection system as victims of child abuse while also fighting a case at the same time.
Yeah.
And that plays a huge role in the early childhood development. 0 to 3, there's an influx of research really validating how important it is to have many resources ages 0 to 3 with the brain development. Yet, that's where a lot of families have the least amount of resources. You don't have access to public schools. Childcare is so expensive. You're just trying to find a place to put your child, while increasing amount of money that is used for rent. And it just definitely plays a role in that. We see that divide when it comes to privilege start from birth.
Sobering question. Follow up on the Germany example. Are their numbers better, like recidivism and stuff like that?
Yes, substantially. I don't have the numbers on hand, but I know recidivism is substantially better than the United States as a whole.
As you were describing the German system, I was thinking about another issue, which I've thought a lot about, and actually had a bunch of people on the podcast talking about, which is homelessness. And it strikes me that the solution is kind of similar in the sense that, like, you can't just design some like blunt policy tool to address an issue like homelessness or crime. We're talking about a human being who has like a very complex psychological situation. And I think the problem is that to do it right requires an enormous amount of money. That's why they haven't solved homelessness in these liberal states where they really want to solve homelessness. They're afraid to tell the voters the truth, which is like, hey, we don't need 1 billion. We need like 40 billion, and it's going to be here forever because we got to do all these services. We got to have the appropriate medical staff. We have to have the housing. Like no one wants to admit the truth. And I imagine with the 2.3 million people in our prisons, to do it right, the number would be substantially more expensive. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think we have this kind of depiction of homeless as, someone who is irresponsible, drunk, and just addicted to drugs on the street. A lot of Americans are one less paycheck away from being homeless, especially with the booming increase of rent, gentrification, limited access to affordable housing, inflation. You could lose your job and in a month be evicted,
Yep.
That's a reality. I think we don't see that face of homelessness. How many kids are homeless, still go to school, couch surfing, trying to find a place to stay, let alone if you're in the foster care system, you're after the age 18 or 21, you're no longer the responsibility of the state. What supports do you have there? And that's why I see a lot of times young people being trafficked thereafter because they need support. And they're very vulnerable to being preyed upon for that matter. And so when it comes to like that kind of that same issue is like acknowledging not just we need $40 billion, but acknowledging that the system as a whole is contributing to this issue in which you could be passionate about homelessness, but you also want to have multi-million dollar condos downtown in an area that's desirable that was formerly used as affordable housing. And that's like there's this tension of it's interesting. I always find those who, love the privilege of having access to, nice housing or love being able to charge more. Not while it's easy to ignore that you're displacing a lot of individuals who later become homeless. And then you turn around like, oh, what happened? Why do we have this homeless population? Well, you just took away a majority of the affordable housing in the city and replaced them with high condos and displacing individuals, also affordable housing in a city where people have access to jobs. And then also people being laid off, jobs going overseas. All of that contributes to the homeless population, and not just, the someone you see on the corner with, alcohol in a paper bag and addicted to drugs. Homelessness looks like homelessness is your everyday people. And there are very few people that are, exempt from becoming homeless at some point in time in your life. It really just takes losing your job and not being able to pay your rent and being evicted. And then your credit score going down. So it's hard to get an apartment, say you finally get the money together. It's easy. Or being in a violent relationship. Moving out because in the interest of your safety. There are limited shelters in a lot of major cities. But it's either safety but being homeless or, living with someone who's a hop, skip, and a jump away from killing you or causing harm to your kids. And those are those tough decisions people have to make that those with privilege never have to confront. And so similar to that kind of concept of personal decisions, I think homelessness is also another area or subject matter in this country in which there's so many things that contribute to it that so many people profit off of that we have yet to confront. And we're just looking at an issue as opposed to the many different issues and inequalities in this country that contribute to it.
Yeah. I found over the years working as an advocate on this issue is that there's like the disconnect that's really at the core of the lack of action is that many American families cannot fathom a situation where like you lost your job and you couldn't call your family and go live with them. And just because it's like that to them seems very foreign, but they don't know anything about foster kids. They don't know anything about people who come from messed up households where the parents are incarcerated or dead, or there's all these other circumstances where people actually don't have a social safety net. Like I'm fortunate, I have a huge social safety net. So like the odds of me being homeless are pretty low. Like I'd have to really piss a lot of people off before I became homeless, but that's not true for all these kids. Like it's really kind of sad. Like these foster kids in particular, they have almost no chance.
Yep, exactly.
Well, I want to, before I forget, because you brought it up earlier, I want to ask you about bail reform. Because one of the things that's happening here in LA is there's a very high profile race amongst a bunch of, prosecutors essentially trying to replace Gascon. And the narrative around town is that everyone is pissed about these these bail reform measures or policies that he's put in place. And it's causing these smash and grab robberies and the uptick in personal theft crimes and all that stuff. So I know you have direct experience working on a bail reform measure in Illinois. Like, what's your take on that situation? Like, is it working? If it's not working, why is it not working, and what should be done?
I think with any policy, but especially with bail reform, as it's centered around like public safety, and which public safety is one of the most effective. A threat to public safety is one of the most effective campaign methods. Saying that someone's going to jeopardize your safety and well-being, your home, your loved ones. People get so triggered and hyper emotional, rightfully so, when they feel like that's something of threat, more than job, more than economic stability, safety. And so it's very easy to play on that fear. And so when it comes to that pushback we're seeing in LA, they're really just feeding people's kind of this innate fear about criminality. And a lot of times we kind of forget that when you are charged, you are innocent until proven guilty. But already when that narrative, you're afraid of bail reform, it demonstrates that you by default assume that anyone who is arrested is guilty. And so because they're guilty, they are criminals. And because they're not being kept in jail pre-trial while they await trial when they're supposed to, where the venue where we're required to demonstrate that they're guilty, we think we by default presume they're a threat to public safety. And that is one of the fundamental issues, in that we believe as a country, especially for certain demographics, Black and brown populations, is that if you're arrested, you must be guilty. And so when it comes to bail reform in LA, people like to really jump on that bandwagon. It's a great political platform to garner support, and like, hey, this individual, it's kind of like that easy target, low hanging fruit to attack a prosecutor on for supporting bail reform and saying this person wants to let all the criminals out. Well, you're assuming that everyone who's awaiting trial is a criminal. And so I think that what we're seeing in LA and across the country is this tough on crime narrative that's been effective in political campaigns since, tale as old as time. And this is no different. And what scares people even more is that when you do have bail reform and you're able to demonstrate that it's not a threat to public safety, that is something that is, that's real, but it's going to take a while to realize. And I think in general, humans stray away from the unfamiliar. Bail is in our Constitution, it is literally in our Constitution. So this country grew up with this concept of bail. So to say that you want to abolish something that has been there since the Second Amendment, it's like, we're going to take your guns away. Like, to take away bail, people feel like, oh, it's like you're going to take our guns away. That's something that we've been accustomed to. And it's something centered around safety. It's hard to walk away from that because people think it's a gamble. Is this going to work? Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? And it working is something that takes time to see. And that's even a greater gamble for people because they don't even know if it's being realized that it's not a threat to public safety. They just see the crime stats as is, not realizing that, like smash and grabs happen now. Who's to say like bail reform doesn't mean it's going to increase it, And so I think that when we see, especially the media kind of portrayal anyone that's advocating for bail reform as letting all the criminals out, speaks to some of the more fundamental issues with the criminal justice system and how we perceive those who are involved or impacted by it. We presume their guilt, especially if they're a certain race.
Yeah, I feel like I've been thinking a lot about this because I keep getting these emails and like people are trying to get me to go to these fundraisers. And so, since you and I talked like a month ago, I started researching it. And I feel like bail reform is one of these things where it's kind of similar in the sense to what we talked about when it came to homelessness and incarceration in general. It's like there's this huge problem in our system and we know it now. We can't hide from it anymore. And the problem is that the justice system is incredibly racially biased in America. And that racially biased systemic problem has produced a situation where a bunch of people are being treated unfairly. And so reformers thought to themselves, well, how can we like whack-a-mole, like to use your phrase, how do we like chip away at this like really big, hairy problem of racism and systemically racist systems? And they came up with this idea of bail reform, and they didn't properly sell it nor execute it in their initial phases, because bail reform to me, and unless tell me if you agree, like bail reform to me is fundamentally about the racism problem in the justice system. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it is. It is. Because we see how when someone sets your bail, it's not just dependent on how much money you have, but whether they deem you as a threat to public safety. And we already know that the color of your skin impacts whether someone deems you as a threat to public safety. When you're Black and brown, a lot of times you're already starting at the default of your threat to public safety because we have racialized crime, again, tale as old as time. When it comes to the framing, I agree. I always say this with advocacy in general, we have to treat it like a political campaign. Messaging is everything. There's a reason why marketers make so much money to sell a product. Well, we're selling a policy. Everyone is a consumer and everyone is selling. And so when you put that frame with policy and advocacy, words matter. The stats and data that you present and how you frame it matters. Being cognizant of your audience and tailoring it to your audience matters. The fact that we have a very limited attention span more and more these days, short and concise with sound bites that people can remember and register, where it becomes embedded in their memory and their default lens of seeing things, that matters. If tobacco industries can get people to smoke cigarettes, as harmful as it may be, maybe we got to hire some of those people to sell bail reform, which is something that is positive. But that's something we cannot overlook, is that marketing is so important. This is actually more high stakes than trying to beat your competitor, whether you can sell the best granola bars or fruit snacks. Selling something that is completely foreign, that no one has experienced, and it already has the kind of disadvantage of being presumed as something that's a threat to public safety. You have to be so intentional when it comes to rolling out that policy. You cannot rely on the moral compass or what you deem to be what the moral compass should be when it comes to pushing a policy, because morality is fairly relative depending on your perception of things or how you've been presented ideas.
Yeah.
And so I think with any type of policy, that is something that needs to be put in play. And I think I'm seeing that more foundations that are funding these advocacy organizations are recognizing that they need to have a communications component when it comes to having these advocacy campaigns.
Yeah, because it's a very complex thing, because you're essentially, with that policy, you're attempting to make a dent in something that's really wrong. Like, minority people end up spending way more time in jail. In many cases, they're innocent, which we're going to talk about that too when we talk about your work with your startup. But so that's a huge negative. And bail reform, wherever you institute, is not going to be neutral. There's going to be a consequence, and you're weighing this huge negative against the potential for a positive of like, hey, we're not going to have a racist justice system, or it won't be as racist. It probably still is racist, because I feel like prosecutorial discretion is still influenced by racism, and the jury process. Quite frankly, I feel like actually in many parts of America, like, you can't argue that it's racist. It is. Americans are racist. Many Americans.
Yeah.
But at least you can try to make a dent in this sort of like early part of the process. And that's the part that wasn't really sold in LA, or I doubt anywhere. Like, it's complicated, and maybe Americans don't have the attention spans for it, but you're weighing these two sort of huge, not obviously connected things against each other. And now the narrative is just flipped the other way, and people are blaming it all on blaming the supposed uptick in crime rates on bail reform. And I feel like it might be even too late for the movement. Like, if these reform DAs are probably going to lose. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, think about San Francisco. They have a theft issue, and if someone were to be like, "Well, if you have bail reform, it's going to contribute to that," I was like, or how about like the crazy rent that, like, the homeless population in San Francisco? These are crimes of poverty. Someone smashing into your car to take a laptop is not like, oh, I'm this menace to society. It's I'm trying to sell this to get something else. I don't need a laptop. I don't have a place to even plug it in. I'm going to sell this laptop. That's actually something that happened last month, in which a friend of mine, his car was smashed the window and stole my son's backpack, which had two tablets in it. That was a crime of poverty. That was a crime. Yeah, my son's bummed, but you know what? He goes to a public school that gives them tablets, so they replaced it. But someone is willing to risk being arrested to get an item. Like, if we were to do like kind of a cost benefit analysis on this, the cost of maybe being arrested versus that immediate benefit of I have something to sell to get my basic necessities such as food. Like, and again, when we talk about personal decisions, many of us have the privilege where we'll never be in a circumstance where we have to make a decision like that. I've never been in a situation where I am so hungry and no source of food. But if I were so hungry, nothing to eat, where you feel like you are deteriorating. I mean, the Snickers commercial even talks about we do things that we normally wouldn't do when we're hungry. Just imagine when you are perpetually hungry with such food insecurity, you will do anything to feed yourself. Now just imagine if you're a parent, especially me as a mother, if my child is hungry and suffering, I will do anything to make sure that is nature to protect my child. So if my child needs diapers and I can't find diapers and he's soiling his diaper, I will steal diapers to make sure my kid is good, unapologetically. And I can't think of many mothers that wouldn't do that for their child. You know, but if I'm willing to lay my life for my child, stealing diapers is a pretty low bar. You know, and so recognizing that, or formula. When your child is hungry, you will steal. That's why formula tends to be stolen very frequently. Formula and diapers. It's a baby. And so when we think of these crimes of poverty, to say, oh, well, because because they're not going to spend time in jail, we're going to see an uptick in crime, where it's like, no, if someone is willing to risk being in jail to provide for their child. Because while I'm in jail, at least in that immediate moment, I've addressed the need of myself or my child. And so that's kind of how I kind of look at kind of this uptick in theft. It's not an uptick in stabbings. It's not an uptick in rape, because those people are going to be incarcerated regardless if they have committed that crime, or they were more likely to be detained in general. But for low-level thefts, or even like $300 thefts, a lot of times it's stemming from a need to meet basic needs.
Yeah. It's sobering to think about that. And the problem of poverty has basically been with us forever and is still here. And it's even in a country as crazy wealthy as this country, like poverty is a problem. And it might be getting worse. Well, it actually is getting worse statistically.
And it's a multiracial one. I encourage people to read Hillbilly Elegy. I know some people are not crazy about the author J.D. Vance, but I read his book and it was eye-opening. The portion and he talks about, these are poor white communities, like the Appalachian areas, and there was one part they call it Mountain Dew Mouth, in which you don't have anything, you don't have formula or anything to feed your child. You give them Mountain Dew, and it obviously rots their teeth. And hearing those examples of everyday people in 2020 plus 2023, 2019, and so forth, that's America. Those are pockets of America that he opened us to a world that many people aren't exposed to, because that population is segmented away that we don't have to see, out of sight, out of mind. And it's crazy. When I read that, I'm like, wow. The fact that this is America, that we have many pockets of communities that are experiencing this, it's sad. It's really, really sad that in a country that on the world stage really, celebrates itself for being the land of opportunity, you have people that have been here forever that can't even make basic needs. That's sad. And I think that, and it's politicized, but it's like, regardless if you're a Republican, Democrat, whatever you fall on the blue to red scale, impacted by poverty. And areas that were overwhelmingly voted for Trump, impacted by poverty in ways that I can't even fathom. And that is something that, that's $1 million question of how to address that, but it's just, it's scary that we have people in this country that encounter that and having to make those decisions in their life. Like, I can't even fathom. Again, I would do anything for my kid. I always joke with our office, with the head of our bond court, when we had bond court, when we had bail, if something were to happen to my child, I will give you a heads up that I'm heading over to the criminal court, because I know I'm going to commit a crime. Like when it comes to like my loved ones, I will do what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And I will be very unapologetic. If I realize I have no other option, I will do what it needs to be done. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is used against me in the court of law. I'd be like, I said what I said.
Yeah, no. This is,
Exhibit A, yep, I said it's
yeah.
fixed, and I stand by it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to
Yeah.
it.
No Miranda rights or whatever they're called in this podcast. Okay. Well, we could talk. I have so many other questions, but I don't want to forget the main reason why I invited you to the show, which is one of the things I'm trying to do with the podcast is highlight the work of people who are trying to use business as a force for good. And it's something that you're doing in your company called Period. So tell us about that. What's the idea behind Period?
Well, Period is, we call it Period and the Sentence. It assists a lawyer's legal fight. It expedites a lawyer's legal fight to get someone released from prison, whether it be someone who's innocent or whether it be someone who has served an extremely long sentence that really stems from a lot of the archaic policies you spoke about earlier. But we're focusing first on innocence claims. That's how we're going to kind of enter the market. And the biggest issue that we found in that 2.3 million people incarcerated, 1 in 20 are innocent. It takes on average 14 years for someone to prove their innocence and get out of prison. One of the leading causes of that is trying to find an attorney to assist you with that. And that is what Period addresses. One, how do we assist individuals incarcerated to identify an attorney that is qualified or can take on their case? And two, how do we support the correspondence for them to fight their case? As we said with defense attorneys, having an attorney with you while you're going through trial makes all the difference. Period is what that looks like on the back end after someone's in prison. Finding an attorney and being able to work with an attorney to prove your innocence. We have created a digital platform that makes that all of that legal correspondence from discovery to correspondence thereafter digital. And we've made it so they no longer have to rely on the mailing system. Currently across the country, people rely on paper mail to reach out to an attorney and communicate thereafter, or crazy phone prices, rates that we see from companies like Securus that is really just financially abusive and exploitive to charge individuals that amount of money to make phone calls. And so Period is free for people in prison, and it has the same user experience as a dating app. And that's why I believe it's kind of user-friendly for attorneys, in which individuals who are in prison create a standing profile. In that profile, it has the standard intake questions that an attorney would ask when deciding whether to review their case. Attorneys can swipe through the profiles of individuals seeking legal assistance and reach out or accept a match with an individual who wants them to review their case. The great thing about Period is as people incarcerated are going through that whole process, they can see where they are and what stage they are for the review and consideration. I created this platform because I had seen so many times as an attorney how reading paper mail from people crying for their innocence or seeking assistance, any form of assistance in prison, delays the process. And when you delay that process, it's not just an inconvenience, but like you're in that kind of environment, like we said, prison. And it saddened me so much that my inability, like many attorneys and advocates across the country, our inability to go through hundreds and hundreds of letters that are so compelling, letters that we want to pursue and provide legal assistance, the lack of staffing barred us from having the impact that we are so passionate and dedicated to have. So how do I create a tool that really assists and supports us to do our job? A job that we've signed up for because it is our purpose and it's our mission. It speaks to our values. And that's what Period is. It answers that kind of issue or kind of solution that we've sought as attorneys, government stakeholders, and advocates to advocate with the best of our abilities, to advocate and maximize our impact for a population that we have committed to providing assistance to. And for those incarcerated, it gives them hope. I've had an individual who spent over 20 years in prison saying, writing letters and getting no responses is so defeating. There's an individual who literally took the book of all licensed attorneys in the state, because he didn't know which ones take on that case. It's a specialized field, and wrote a letter to every licensed attorney in the state, hoping that one of them was the type of attorney that he needed and could respond. What Period does is presents the person in prison with a population of attorneys who take on these types of cases and are willing to take on clients. So bypassing this kind of unknown world universe of what's out there and putting it right at your lap, saying, this is the universe of attorneys that you can reach out to. And when you reach out to them, they're going to actually receive it. And that alone, I can't underestimate how powerful that is, of knowing that you have a chance, you have a chance, a greater chance. At least it's going somewhere, as opposed to, it's almost like texting someone and not knowing if they got your text message. They didn't even leave you on red. At least this, I know you got my text message. Everything's a blue bubble, And so that is something that I'm so excited to provide to the world, because I myself am so passionate about this work. And I want to help as many people as possible. And anything that could enhance my ability to do that helps me fulfill my life purpose. And it also makes me proud to do the work that I'm doing. To know that, I'm giving it all I can. And Period really kind of enhances our ability to give it all we can. And then for those in prison to know that, you got a fighting chance, just a fighting chance makes all the difference in how I go through and navigate the experience of incarceration. That we always talk about, what's your why? And knowing that your why can actually be achieved, or you have a greater chance of it being achieved, just fuels the purpose that you have in this space and the level of hope that you have.
And where in the evolution of the company is Period right now? Is it already functioning?
Yeah, so we have created a prototype and we're hoping to launch by next year. One of the biggest barriers, as we see it with all startups and companies, is funding. Funding to do it full time. And so my last day at work is December 4th, and I'm excited to do this full time. Again, I have a safety net in which, if somebody doesn't work out, at least I have somewhere to go, but I also have a kid. And that is a financial commitment. So I'm not like a 20-year-old who, just can live in a parent's basement. I have bills and health insurance. That's a big one. But I'm looking forward to launching next year and to test it first, to do alpha testing, hopefully with New York. And just to see the impact that we can have and how we can tweak and tailor it to, again, maximize the impact of attorneys and advocates who are so committed to this space, and to provide assistance and hope to this population. And the business side of it is the attorneys who are interested in potentially taking these cases would pay some kind of subscription or something like that? Yep. So it's a SaaS platform, and it is subscription-based. So similar to how attorneys pay for the efficiency of legal research through LexisNexis and Westlaw, basically anything with Thomas Reuters, is really a lot of times about efficiency. And how can I create a product that enables lawyers to be more efficient to get to that end goal? Period has that similar business models that you are paying to be able to really maximize your impact. We are making your job easier and thus your purpose more fulfilling. And yeah, that's our value proposition. Currently, with a lot of nonprofits who already have limited resources when it comes to staffing, they have to hire someone to read, type, input the information, manage the mail, and so forth. And what Period does is if you don't have the capacity to add on additional paralegals to do that administrative work, now you have a digital platform that does it on the outset. And being able to take away the time that's needed for administrative tasks and focus it all on the very substantive legal work you need to do to assist your clients. Yeah. And I think most people, I didn't know this before I got your sort of pitch deck, but if the estimates are right, if 1 in 20 are innocent, there's well over 100,000 people in prison that are not supposed to be there. Exactly. And 24,000 years wrongfully spent thus far. And mind you, innocent as in proven innocent. So we don't even know like the population that's still, inside completely. We don't have the full picture. It's even greater than that.
I see. So that 1 in 20 is based on what's happening now of people getting proven innocent later. Yeah. So almost certainly is higher.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Which goes back to what we talked about earlier when we were talking about bail reform. Like when you have a biased justice system, like that number, who knows what that number is? I mean, it was probably worse. Like if you rewind the clock to what we talked about earlier, it was probably way worse in the post Civil War era. Probably, I would think so. But it's still horrifically bad in this country, almost certainly.
Exactly. And and the interesting part is when you criminalize it, you have a wider net to bring in. So before, slavery, chattel slavery, you were enslaved. Someone up north that wasn't enslaved was not brought into for free labor. Now, when you can criminalize anybody. It's someone who has 4 generations of being free, that makes no difference if you're arrested and incarcerated. You're just like anybody else. And that's the other scary thing of before with the slave states relying on the property that they have and losing the ability to bring in more slaves from the continent of Africa. Now you have a whole population that the expansion is endless. If we can create a new crime, that's a wider net that we can cast and more people that we can have do labor. Whereas before you're limited to the slaves that were currently in the country and procreating for that purpose to have more slaves. But there is no cap when it comes to incarceration. You can always create a new crime with new laws.
All right. Well, I wish you the luck with Period. It sounds like a very, very cool venture, civic entrepreneurial venture, which we're all about supporting here. Last question for you. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for being so open to share your opinions on all these issues.
Thank you.
How did you get interested in this space in the first place? Like, why is this your life's work?
That's a really good question. And it's been such a journey. I come from a lineage of freedom fighters, and people that have really protested injustice. My grandfather, my late grandfather, was a diplomat. But prior to that, my family's Malawian. He was someone that was fighting colonialism. And for Malawi, to essentially have it be its own country and not a colony of the British. What that entailed in fighting for their independence is that he was kidnapped by those who had colonial power and put into a prison. He was a political prisoner for kind of protesting advocating for the independence of what is now Malawi. They had him for 2 years, and then when Malawi gained its independence, he was released and so forth. But being exposed to the injustices, especially those stemming from race and gender, is something that I have been exposed to since I was a child. My bedtime stories were Chinua Achebe's books, about, man of the people and talking about colonialism and, the impact it has on, Black and brown people across the world. I was raised in that climate. And so there's always been this desire to push back. Because that's my bloodline. We've always pushed back. And so as someone born here, I asked myself, what does pushing back look like? And just informing myself of history and just like what has contributed to what we see now as America and I experienced as a Black woman. But then when I went to law school, I went to University of Chicago Law School, which is on the south side of Chicago. And I learned so much about what does race look like when it comes to the legal system. And being in Chicago while learning about this, it wasn't something I just saw in a casebook or research or data, but I was seeing it around me and seeing how young people experience policing differently, seeing how people with criminal records experience economic opportunity differently, and seeing how communities, you could see it. You see the disparities in wealth and housing and even just like access to parks and kind of services we take for granted. You see it in Chicago. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in America. So seeing the racial disparities is not something you have to look into a book or look at data. It's called taking the train downtown. Take the Green Line from Oak Park to downtown. I see disparities by going through each stop every 2 minutes and seeing what the neighborhoods look like going from the affluent suburb that is Oak Park down to downtown Chicago. It's apparent. It's apparent. And that has fueled my passion even more in trying to find out what avenues can I go through to, one, be exposed to inequities, and then two, identify vehicles to combat them. What coalitions and communities can I join to collaborate with other people that are trying to address a lot of these systemic issues? And more important, how can I leverage my privilege to enhance the collective effort of people across this country to combat oppression, racism, and inequality? And one of the things that I've learned is that in doing this work, what's more powerful than leading and convening people is being convened and trying to figure out how can I be of assistance to those impacted. Because the work that I do, the consequences for it not working doesn't fall on me. And so that's why I think it's so important that communities impacted need to be leading policy. It's not enough to bring them to the table. They need to be dictating what's on the menu for the movement, dictating how this is going to play out, how it's going to be implemented, because they have skin in the game. And instead of focusing on, as advocates, we're like, be the voice of the people. We need to speak for these people, the voiceless. No, actually, you need to just pass the mic. Pass the mic that has been bestowed upon you because of your privilege, and leverage that privilege to ensure that they're the ones that can be their own voice. They can speak for themselves. We just have not created a platform for them to voice out their concerns. And more importantly, what they deem to be the appropriate solutions to their concerns, being that they will experience the collateral consequences of ineffective solutions.
Very inspiring. I can tell that the freedom fighter is like part of your DNA.
Yeah, you get me so fired up, and then next thing you know, someone's like, "Why is Michelle yelling at someone at work?" I'm like, "I'm sorry." Injustice just brings out a lot of anger.
No, it's good. Look, and I appreciate your perspective and sort of the call to action and what you just described there. I think it's super inspiring. Well, Michelle, this has been a fun, fascinating conversation. I'm pulling for you in your work and with Period, and look forward to staying in touch. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Nick Halaris Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.